I have heard stories about places like this before, cursed lands and haunted mountains, but I never believed them. Now I understand. The mountain's hunger never truly goes away. It is always there, watching and waiting. I can never forget what I have seen and felt, and I know I will carry it with me forever. I have always loved the thrill of adventure, and that's why I decided to become a solo adventurer. I felt like the mountains, especially the Himalayas, were calling to me. So, I wanted to experience the raw beauty of the Himalayan wilderness, far away from the noise of the city. There was something about the towering peaks and vast empty space that drew me in. But deep down, I also knew there was danger lurking in the shadows. The Himalayas are beautiful, but they are also unforgiving. The trek started as I had imagined, and every step made me feel more alive. The cool mountain air, the sight of the snow-capped peaks, and the silence all around were incredible. I was completely alone, and it was just me and the mountains. So, I had planned my route carefully and expected challenges, but nothing could prepare me for what was ahead. I felt small under the towering peaks, but it wasn't scary. It was humbling. For a moment, I thought about the stories I had heard about these mountains. Some people said they were haunted, others claimed the wilderness itself was alive. But I pushed those thoughts aside because I had been hiking for days, and everything was going well. I was in good shape. I had enough supplies and felt confident in my survival skills. But I still felt like I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, because the silence was too deep and too complete. There were no animals, no birds, nothing but only the sound of my footsteps in the snow. But then, the clouds began to roll in. The weather in the Himalayas can change quickly, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. As the wind picked up, I started to feel a sense of unease because the mountains were beautiful, but I also realized they could be deadly. I had read about the dangers of mountain survival, how quickly a dangerous trek could turn into a fight for your life. But I still kept going because I was a solo adventurer, after all, and this was my dream. Even though I was excited about what lay ahead, there was a nagging feeling that something bad was coming. I tried to ignore it, but the mountains seemed to grow colder and the wind was more biting. It wasn't long before I realized how dangerous this isolated adventure could truly be. If I didn't stay alert, and if I didn't keep my wits about me, I might never make it out of these mountains. The thought was chilling, but I pushed it away because I hoped that my trek would remain a thrilling journey and not turn into a horror experience. The call to adventure had led me here, to this. Beautiful, but it was a dangerous place too. I had to face what was coming, whatever it was. And little did I know the true test of survival was about to begin. From the beauty to the horror of the mountain happened so fast because one moment, I was enjoying the trek, with the snow falling lightly around me, and the next, an avalanche. Suddenly the ground shook violently beneath my feet, and I could hear the terrifying roar of snow crashing down the mountain. The sound was deafening, like the mountain itself was alive, angry and coming for me. Then, I tried to run, but the snow was too fast and it swept me off my feet and carried me away. I fought against it, but the snow kept pushing me and pulling me deeper into the mountain. For a moment, I couldn't breathe because the snow was everywhere and they were cold and suffocating. Then I managed to dig myself out, but I was far from safety because my supplies were buried, and the route back to base camp was completely blocked. Now, being alone in the wilderness, I realized that the true challenge had begun, because the avalanche had trapped me in the wilderness, isolated from any hope of rescue. My food supply was limited, and I knew that I had to survive. The cold was unbearable, and I could feel my body growing weaker by the hour. Now the avalanche had destroyed everything I thought was safe. But there was no turning back now. Even though I was scared, I knew I couldn't panic because if I panicked, I wouldn't survive. I tried to keep calm and focus on finding shelter, but the snow kept falling. Now I felt like my chances of survival seemed to shrink with every passing hour. Suddenly, I thought about the horror stories I had heard about people lost in the Himalayas. Would I become another part of that terrifying history? Now I felt like the mountain wilderness felt alive, as if it was watching me and waiting for me to make a mistake. Every step was harder, and every breath was more difficult. But I had to keep going because I had no choice. Survival was the only thing that mattered. The avalanche had taken everything from me, but I wasn't going to let it take my life. After hours of walking through the snow, I was totally weak and exhausted. Then I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a hut. A small and abandoned hut sitting in the middle of the wilderness. For a moment, I didn't know if I should be relieved or afraid, because the idea of finding shelter was a relief. But something about this place felt wrong. The hut was old, weathered, and covered in snow, and I felt like it had been abandoned for years. But I had no choice because I needed warmth and food. Then I stepped inside and hoped it would provide some relief. The inside was dark, and I had to use my flashlight to see. Inside, it was cold, and it was much colder than I expected. But I saw there was a small stove in the corner, and I quickly lit a fire and hoped it would warm me up. The flames crackled, and for a moment, I felt a sense of safety. But that feeling didn't last. Later, I explored the hut, and then I noticed something strange, because I saw carved symbols covering the walls. At first, they looked like simple designs, but when I looked closer, I saw that they were more than that, because the symbols were disturbing, twisted, and they were almost like warnings. I couldn't understand what they meant, but they made my skin crawl. I felt like the hut was hiding something, and it was something dark. Meanwhile, the wind howled outside, and I realized that I was truly alone in this isolated adventure. The wilderness felt even more alive now, as if it was speaking to me through those eerie symbols. Was this a safe place? Or was it a trap, waiting to claim me as its next victim? I didn't know, but I couldn't leave. The storm was getting worse, and my chances of survival outside were slim. For now, the hut was my refuge, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something much darker than I could ever imagine. The fire crackled in the small stove, but the warmth didn't reach me because my eyes kept drifting back to the strange symbols on the walls, and their eerie presence was growing stronger as I stayed longer in this hut. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me, something from the past. Then, I decided I needed to look deeper into the history of this place, because I had to understand what happened here, even if it made me feel uneasy. As I searched around the room, I found old wooden boxes. Some of them were broken and dusty. Then, I discovered a collection of strange artifacts, old tools, worn-out clothes, and what looked like a journal. The journal was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was almost impossible to read. I carefully opened it and hoped to find answers. The pages were filled with notes and drawings. Then I started to read them, and a chilling story began to unfold, because the people who had lived in this hut had vanished without a trace. They had come to the Himalayas and sought refuge, but something had gone terribly wrong. There were notes about strange occurrences in the mountains, whispers in the wind, shadows that moved on their own, and a deep fear that never left them. The more I read, the more I realized that these people had been haunted by the very wilderness I was now trapped in. One entry stood out. It spoke of the hunger of the mountains, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Suddenly my heart was beating. Were they talking about the mountain itself? Or something else? Whatever it was, it seemed like it had claimed them, one by one. The journal's final entry was written in a frantic hand, as if the writer was running out of time. It simply said, "Don't stay. Leave the mountain, or it will take you too." Cold chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal. Suddenly, I felt like the air in the hut felt heavier now, and the fire seemed to flicker more wildly. Had the people who lived here known something I didn't? Were they trying to warn me? Then I looked around, but the symbols on the wall stared back at me like they were judging and watching me. Now fear was starting to grow inside me, because I had been hoping for safety in this abandoned hut. But now I wasn't so sure, because it seemed like the mountain was alive and it wasn't finished with me yet. Then, I tried to ignore the unease building in my chest. But deep down, I knew the stories in the journal weren't just stories. They were warnings, warnings that I had ignored. Inside the tent, Now I felt like the more I stayed in the hut, the longer I felt something wasn't right because of the mountain and the wilderness. It all felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. At first I thought it was just the isolation getting to me and the silence making me paranoid. But then, I heard it. The whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind, but they seemed to be calling my name. Then I shook my head and told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Later I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes I saw shadows moving outside the window. I knew they weren't animals because they were too large and too strange. They seemed to move in patterns like they were circling the hut and waiting for something. Then I opened my eyes and I looked at the outside, but nothing was there. For a moment I thought I was just imagining things, but I still heard the whispers grow louder and more urgent. Being alone in the hut at night, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I started to feel as though the peaks themselves were watching me and waiting for something. Every sound and every movement made me jump, and it felt like the mountain was alive, with an appetite I couldn't understand. Was it the same hunger the people in the journal had written about? Was the mountain itself trying to claim me? Now I felt like the longer I stayed, the more intense it became, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt like something dark and twisted was growing in the wilderness around me. Suddenly, my mind raced, and fear began to take root, because I wasn't alone here. The mountain was alive, and it was hungry. The hunger had awakened, and now it was calling to me. That night, I couldn't sleep well, so I sat quietly by the fire and stared into the flames. I felt like the hut felt colder now, even though the fire crackled in the stove. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the mountain was waiting and watching me. Then suddenly, I saw him. A figure stood just outside the door, and he was barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then he stepped closer. His face was hidden under a hood, and his clothes were torn, like they had been worn for a long time. His presence was strange and unsettling. He didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to pierce through me as if he could see into my soul. For a moment, I was frozen and unsure of what to do. Should I call out to him, or should I hide? But before I could decide, the figure spoke in a low and harsh whisper. "You must leave," he said. His voice was filled with urgency, and it was almost like a warning. "Leave before it takes you too." Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. Was this a man or something else? Was he real or just another trick of the mountain? My heart raced and I tried to find the words to respond. But before I could, the figure turned and disappeared into the night as quickly as he had come. I stumbled to the door and my hands were shaking. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The cold wind howled outside and I could feel the pressure of the mountain closing in on me. Had I imagined the stranger? Or was he a real person and warning me of something terrible? I didn't know what to think and my mind was chaotic now. The mountain's hunger, the whispers and the shadows, they were all becoming too much. My mind was starting to break and the stranger's words echoed in my ears. "Leave before it takes you too." But where would I go? What was I supposed to do? Then I backed away from the door, and my eyes were searching the room for something to hold on to, but the hut felt like it was suffocating me. I was trapped, and I knew it. The mountain had claimed the people before me, and now it seemed like it wanted me too. I couldn't escape the feeling that the stranger had been real, and he had known something I didn't. Was the mountain really alive? Was it watching me? The fear was growing stronger, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay here. But even if I left, would I survive out there in the wilderness? The mountain's hunger was not something I could outrun. Now the time in the hut was horrible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen because the stranger's warning still echoed in my mind. But there was no way to escape. The mountain was everywhere, and I was trapped in its grip. But later I decided to search everywhere in the hut, and that's when I found the hidden room. It was behind a false wall in the corner of the hut, tucked away and almost forgotten. I'd been searching for anything that could help me understand what was happening when I accidentally pushed against the wall. Inside, there were old, rotting wooden crates and a strange altar in the center of the room. The altar was covered in strange symbols, just like the ones on the walls of the hut. But these symbols were different, because they looked ancient, almost like they had been carved by something that didn't belong to this world. Suddenly, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I examined them. Then, I noticed something else too. On the altar, there were remnants of old sacrifices, bones, pieces of clothing, and dried blood. Suddenly, when I saw them, my stomach churned, as I realized the truth because the hut wasn't just a shelter, it was a sacrificial trap tied to the mountain's curse. The people who had lived here before me hadn't just disappeared. They had been sacrificed to the mountain, feeding its hunger. After I had realized the truth, my heart was racing. The mountain wasn't just alive, it was a force that needed to feed, and the hut was part of its twisted ritual. I had been drawn here, just like the others before me. The hunger of the mountain would not be satisfied until it had taken me too. But how could I escape? The mountain had already claimed so many. Was there any way out of this nightmare? Now I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't think anymore. The walls of the hut seemed to close in on me, and the hunger of the mountain grew stronger. It wasn't just the hut. It was the entire wilderness, and it was the mountain itself. I was caught in its trap. Now I couldn't think anymore because of the truth of the mountain's hunger, the sacrifice, and the trap. It was all too much. The fear had taken over my mind, and I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The walls of the hut seemed to shift, and the shadows danced in ways they shouldn't. Then I tried to leave again, but the door wouldn't open. It was like the hut itself was keeping me inside and trapped me in its grip. My thoughts were racing, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't leave either because the mountain was too powerful and it was too alive. Later, I began to see things that weren't there. At first, it was just flickering in the corner of my eyes. Shadows were moving where there were none. But soon they became clearer. I saw faces twisted and contorted, and they were staring at me from the walls. They were the faces of the people who had come before me and were trapped in the same nightmare. Suddenly, the whispers returned, but now they were louder and more insistent. It seemed like they were telling me to stay and telling me that the mountain wouldn't let me go. I could hear them all around me, in my head and in my ears. They weren't just whispers, they were voices, screaming at me and begging me to stay. Then I collapsed to the floor and clutched my head in my hands. The hallucinations were getting worse. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't because the hut was no longer just a shelter. It was a prison, and I was losing my mind. But still, I couldn't escape because the mountain had a hold on me, and I was slipping away bit by bit. Now I knew I couldn't escape the mountain's curse easily, but I had to try because I remembered the path I had taken to reach the hut, and I knew I could follow it back. But it wouldn't be easy because the snow had been thick and the storm had already begun. The mountain was unforgiving, and every step felt like a fight. But I couldn't stay here because I couldn't let the mountain win. Then, I packed what little food I had left and took the small amount of water that had survived the freezing temperatures. I had no idea how far I would have to go to find safety, but I knew the hut wouldn't be enough to protect me anymore. If I stayed here, I'd be giving in to the mountain's hunger. As I stepped outside, the wind hit me like a wall. The snow was blinding and I could barely see where I was going. The cold burned my skin, but I kept moving because I had no choice. The mountain was alive and it was hungry, but I was determined to survive. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure of the stranger again and stood just out of reach in the storm. His face was hidden, but his presence was like a shadow in the snow. I tried to call out to him, but the wind swallowed my words. I couldn't trust the mountain or anything it showed me. It was all part of its game, and I refused to be part of it. The escape was far from easy, but I pushed through. My muscles screamed, my breath came in ragged gasps, and I couldn't stop shaking from both fear and the cold. But I wasn't going to die here. The mountain might want me, but I was going to fight with everything I had. The escape wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about fighting back against the terror that the mountain had put into my mind. If I could survive this, I could survive anything. so I just had to make it out alive. Now I was completely exhausted. My body ached from the cold and the struggle to stay on my feet. The mountain had tested me in ways I never thought possible, but now I faced the final trial. This was my last chance. If I failed, I would never escape the mountain's grip. Meanwhile, the storm was still raging and the snow was deeper than before. Each step felt like a battle, and I could feel my strength fading. But I kept moving because I couldn't stop now. The mountain was furious, and I had to get through it. Suddenly, I heard the howling wind, but it wasn't just the wind. It felt like the mountain itself was calling to me and trying to pull me back. But I kept pushing forward, even though every part of me wanted to collapse. If I stopped, I knew I wouldn't make it. The ground beneath my feet was treacherous, slippery, and unstable. There were moments when I almost slipped, but somehow I kept my balance. I was scared, but I couldn't let fear control me. The mountain was trying to break me, but I wasn't going to let it. Then I heard a sound, a growl, deep and low, like something alive and something huge. My heart pounded and I spun around looking for the source of the noise, but there was nothing there, just the storm. I couldn't see anything through the snow, but I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on me. It wasn't just the weather, it was the mountain itself, angry and alive, fighting to keep me from leaving. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and then I slipped and fell into a deep crevasse. The cold surrounded me like a vice, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it out. But then, with every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself up, grabbing the edge and pulling myself back up. I was bleeding, my body battered, but I couldn't stop. The mountain was trying to take me, but I wouldn't let it because this was my final battle, so I had to survive no matter what. Later I made it through the storm, fought the mountain's fury and survived. But even though I was free of the cursed hut, the wilderness was still a danger. The Himalayas had left their mark on me, both physically and mentally, and I would never be the same again. The snow had started to slow, but the cold was still unbearable. My body ached, and I could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. Every step felt like it could be my last, but I pushed on. The mountain was still behind me, and I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to survive. Because of this incident, I learned so much in the past days, and learned what it meant to fight for survival, to keep going even when every part of me screamed to stop. But I had also learned that the Himalayas were unforgiving because the wilderness wasn't just a place. It was a living and breathing force that could take everything from you in an instant. As I trudged through the snow, I thought about the people who had come before me, the ones who had been trapped in the hut and lost to the mountain's hunger. They hadn't made it, but I tried to escape, and this thought kept me going. The wilderness was harsh, but I had learned to face it. I had faced the mountain's terror, and I had survived. I knew it wasn't over yet, but I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came next. Now I thought I was free. The storm had stopped, the snow had slowed, and I had made it out of the wilderness. But even now, as I sit here, I feel the mountain's hunger still inside me because it's like the terror never really left. I survived, yes, but at what cost? I think about everything I went through, how I escaped the cursed hut, how I fought against the storm and the cold. For a moment, I believed I had won, but I can't forget what I saw and what I felt. The mountain was alive, it was angry and hungry. Even though I am no longer trapped in its grip, its presence still haunts me. Sometimes I wake up in the night, my heart racing and thinking that I can still hear the wind howling and feel the mountain's cold breath on my neck. The terror lingers, like a shadow I can't shake. But I know I'm not the same person I was before because the mountain changed me. I have heard stories about places like this before, cursed lands and haunted mountains, but I never believed them. Now, I understand. The mountain's hunger never truly goes away. It is always there, watching and waiting. I can never forget what I have seen and felt, and I know I will carry it with me forever. The hunger isn't just in the mountain, it is in me now too. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.